To get straight into it. My name is Renaud Proch. I'm the director of Independent Curators International, ICI. I'm based in New York. ICI is a network organization that provides access to contemporary art through traveling exhibitions, as well as support to the work of curators at different stages of their careers through professional development programs, conferences, talks, and so on and so forth. And I'm delighted to be welcoming you all today and to be moderating this panel. Although one of our panelists is missing, and I think his flight was delayed and he's on his way from Cape Town Airport, so hopefully Khwezi Gule will join us towards the end of this session. But, in the meantime, we are here with Melissa Gobe and Claudio Cravero. Welcome, both of you. Quickly, as introductory remarks, I just want to say that we have two speakers and hopefully a third one coming who really represent a great variety of what it means to be a curator today. Coming from different contexts, working in different contexts. And I think that is perhaps our first clue to what we will be discussing today in terms of what curating is in the 21st century. I think another immediate and perhaps somewhat obvious note to take about the topic is that we're of course only 19 years into the 21st century, so I think the topic is somewhat aspirational as well, what we'd like to see curating be in the 21st century, as most of it is yet to come. And I hope that by the end of this conversation we might have some discussion about what our aspirations might be in this regard. So, quick introductions of our panelists today. Melissa Gobe is an independent curator, so you're representing the independent side of the fields today. You're also an artist. And as an independent curator, Melissa has worked in a variety of institutional contexts and with different art collections, including the Constitutional Court Art Collection and the UJ Art Collection, University of Johannesburg Art Collection, as well as the MTN Art Collection. Melissa has occupied many curatorial roles, curated projects and exhibitions, including, for example, the MTN New Contemporaries in 2008, Space Currencies in Contemporary Art in 2010, Curatorial Exchange in Whitby, Sweden, and contributing to accompanying catalogs for those exhibitions, as well as other publications, including a monograph of Sam sorry. I can't say that, but I think you all know. And I won't butcher his name. She's also worked with Kaoru, a platform for African contemporary artists and cultural practitioners. Claudio, welcome. Claudio is a consulting curator for Expo 2020, a World Expo that will be hosted in Dubai next year. He has been based in the Gulf region since 2014, when he worked at the King Abdulaziz Center in Saudi Arabia for 4 years. Through his work as a curator, he has also as a writer, who has published in over 15 publications, as well as magazines and blogs. Claudio has investigated the relationship between cultural identity and public censorship across the Gulf region. He has served as a member of international juries and art collection committees, and has lectured on museum best practices and contemporary art from the Middle East. So, off to the start, we have already two different contexts represented, two different practices. I've asked each of you to prepare a short presentation of your practice and to give us some clues as to what you think are perhaps some of the most striking facets of your work in speaking about curating in the 21st century. So, Melissa, maybe Claudio, you want to start? Yes. Sorry, this is very, I was expecting three panelists, so I'm a little bit thrown, but we'll get through this. Bear with me. Claudio.
Yes, thank you so much. It must be said that when I got asked this question, curating 21st century, which is, as you said, correctly, Renaud, is a wide, capacious topic. It could be everything, it could be nothing. So we can start from right and go into left without getting to a point. When I got this question, what I thought immediately that makes art different in 21st century is this expanded field that of possibilities that culturally, geographically, politically speaking, all we have in the art societies are offering to us in that sense. Societies that are ever-changing, but also are the world in which we live and we have to respond to it somehow. So when it comes to the Middle East, and more precisely to the Gulf region, where I have been working with for 5 years, it must be said that curating is a very recent job. It's as young as contemporary art is in that region, especially related to those few museums that have just opened over the last decade. However, contemporary art is true, it is a very pretty new phenomenon, but it's also part of the political agenda of governments and institutions alike. Well, what I would like to touch upon with you today are specifically three main subjects that I would like to discuss with you. The first one is a time perspective, because first and foremost, we cannot curate without taking into account a specific time frame. Second of all, the phenomenon of inclusiveness. And third, to discuss with you, is a viable path how to undertake actually the challenges curating in 21st century to create a universal narrative. When we talk about time perspective, it must be said in the Gulf, when we talk about the past has been already investigated and explored extensively and very much aligned with the central historical hierarchies that we all refer to when we talk about history. But museum institutions nowadays are more projected towards the future than talking about the past or the present. So future has somehow become kind of mantra, as an obsession. Everybody talks about this compulsive fascination for what's going to be next. That creates very, broadly speaking, some discrepancies in the discourse of curating the 21st century, where we live in now, the present time. But it is also true that I think about Dubai, and I'm now collaborating with the Expo 2020. The title itself is Connecting Minds, Creating the Future. And it is completely all about the future, so future opportunities and sustainability in the perspective as well. And Dubai will also have very soon the first museum dedicated to the future, which means that we are somehow losing the sight of the present. But it's also true that this standpoint, this forward-looking standpoint, is not new for the region at all. It dates back to 1940s and late 60s, when the crucial states, they were not emirates at all back then, because they got unified only in 1971. They were called crucial states, and the discovery of oil in that area came into being very late compared to other regions or other provinces in the Gulf. If you think about Saudi Arabia, where oil got discovered in 1938. So back then, and we're talking again about late 60s, the ruler of Dubai, Sheikh Rashid Al Maktoum, was already thinking about the future of the city and the sustainability of the city itself in a time, think about the generations to come, in a time where it's now supposed to be late 2030, where oil production and exploration will not be longer sustainable for the economy. There is a very easy but yet effective quotation by Sheikh Rashid Al Maktoum, which says, "My grandfather rode a camel, my father rode a camel, I drive a Mercedes, my son drives a Land Rover, his son will probably drive a Land Rover too, but his son may ride a camel anew." Which means that he understood immediately, straight away, that he needed to work to improve the economy of Dubai by building infrastructures, which means ports, tunnels, trade center, and so forth. in order to avoid any kind of possible unfortunate or dystopian scenarios for its posterity. Getting back to the present, because we're talking about curating in the 21st century, as I said before, there is this constant question about what's next, what's going to happen. And this obsession for future-like scenarios as well is pervading not only the art field, it's everywhere. If we think about on another sector, let's say the TV show Netflix is now broadcasting this Black Mirror, which is a dystopian TV series talking about the use of technology, at some point in time in the future being so disruptive and actually dystopian, as I said before. So when we see the future in our storytelling as curators, we lose actually the sight of the present because we are projecting ourselves toward the future. And then it implies also the feelings, because the more we think about the past, the more we live in regret. When we project ourselves toward the future, we experience anxiety, which means that we are losing actually the now, what's going on now, the urgency of the present time. The second point that I mentioned before is inclusiveness. About this point, it is to be said that there are precise governmental policies which are under the ministries. They are called specifically Saudization when we talk about Saudi Arabia, Qatarization when we talk about Qatar, and obviously Emiratization when we talk about the United Arab Emirates, which are simply policies in place to force to include local artists within museum collections and exhibitions. What does that mean in the curatorial field? It means that curators have to include forcibly regional art as per mandatory sets of guidelines. Well, if on one hand inclusiveness is very much positive because it plays a pivotal, essential role to reconsider history itself as we know it, on the other hand, inclusiveness when it's forced and mandatory is also a risk of tokenism. I don't know if you're familiar with this word, but tokenism is a phenomenon because an increasing number of companies are now including female quotas, so the tokens, within their own work environments against gender discrimination. In traditional museums, this translates as, I'm acting as a curator, so you artist, I should include it, I have to include you, even though you shouldn't be here. You should stand in another position. Or how can your artwork fit my narrative in the exhibition that I'm trying to curate? Which means that inclusiveness sometimes can also undermine and mislead the quality of the exhibition itself, even though quality is another concept and subject to be clarified. This consideration will enable us to move forward the third and final point, which is towards a universal narrative. And then I'm getting to a closure, and I'm going to mention also some more concrete examples of how we curate in the 21st century. Just to wrap up what I said before, to work as curator in such a challenging scenario means that on the one hand, we need to blur the past with the present towards the future, in favor of the future. And on the other hand, we need to be more inclusive of the regional and the local. But how can we curate exhibitions that can keep on telling stories about our lives, about our human nature today with the urgency of the now? Exhibitions at this point serve as corrective in the sense that they can correct the hegemonic cultural one-way approach that we are used to adopting when we look at art history as a linear, static narrative. So this way of thinking of exhibition allows us to see those mistakes throughout history and somehow correct them while offering a more granular and more inclusive vision of the past. The case in point is the one of the new Louvre Abu Dhabi. I don't know if you had the chance to visit it, but to me, it's exactly the epitome of a museum in the 21st century that wants to level hierarchies when they look at history. History at Louvre Abu Dhabi represents the polyphony of multiple voices and stories that go really beyond geographies in order to contribute to the construction of the universal narrative. Again, when we say universal narrative is another topic coming into being, because what does that mean? What does being universal mean? Who is entitled to dictate the universality of knowledge in this sense? For Louvre Abu Dhabi, being universal means focusing on what unites us. The story of mankind's achievements that go beyond geographical classification, times, and places. It means to bring together different cultures to shine fresh light on the shared stories of humanity. So the gallery at Louvre Abu Dhabi are installed to cover from prehistory to the present day, beyond geography. And as we said, they don't talk about the geography. They are installed according to a chronological order, and they then juxtapose and overlap different regions at a certain moment in time in order to grab the zeitgeist of those parts of the world. What stands out in this new presentation of Louvre is that what was previously considered as a specialized area because it was deemed to be marginal compared to the center is now being investigated as a central narrative among others. This approach also allows us to expand our traditional canons, allows us to avoid ghettoizing themes such as woman art, gender, identity, black art, queer art. In the same room, and I can give you the real example, gallery number 4 in Louvre Abu Dhabi is dedicated to universal religions. And we had in the same room, and it was the first time that I saw something like that, it was so enlightening somehow. We have the statue of the Virgin Mary with the child. We have the copy of a blue Quran, the sacred book of Islam, and a statue, a gold statue of a Buddha. They were able to put the 3 symbols of the main religions and philosophies worldwide in the same room under the main umbrella of divine light. So light in the gallery becomes the common thread of those 3 religions and philosophies. Whether it is the surah taken from the Quran, the halo around the saints and Christianity, or the physical statue of a Buddha within that gallery, which is actually the manifestation of the radiant light. Finally, to get to my conclusion, what Louvre Abu Dhabi teaches us about curating in the 21st century is that our approach to curating is a constant struggle to oppose cultural structures of domination. And we, I mean curators and art professionals alike, are very much engaged in the responsibility in the civic role that we all play in order to shape the present time and giving some hope for the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Claudio. Melissa?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Melissa Gobe, as everyone has just mentioned. And my sort of response in thinking about the notion of curating in the 21st century sort of conjured up some complexities that I think are quite evident in South African society currently. So I would like to look at 3 particular institutions that I'm engaged with in varying capacities. One being the Constitutional Court, the second being the MTNSA Foundation, which is a corporation that started its collection right at the beginning of our democratic era, and the third being the UJ Art Collection. So the Constitutional Court would be a good place to start in the sense that it should be a reflection of this new era, this new democratic era in terms of the Constitution of South Africa, right? And therefore, what is reflected in the collection should be evident, or at least easily evident to any visitor that comes into the court. bearing in mind that the Constitutional Court is a practicing institution that is linked to government but is also separate from government. And in starting the collection, the collection was started by Justice Albie Sachs and Justice Yvonne Mahoro. And the works are accessioned into the collection via donation or long-term loan, right? I think in having worked with the collection, one of the things that I found quite interesting is that there wasn't necessarily a reflection of the contemporary issues that the court was actually dealing with on a daily basis. So for example, the SASA issue. In an ideal world, just being able to tackle the kind of issue of how monies are dispersed and how grants are dispersed to people within South African society. One would have wanted an artist to at least engage in that process. Another one is the sort of the happenings that jostle between the parliamentary stage and the Constitutional Court, and how sometimes things get lost in translation or mandates are not necessarily delivered upon in that space. I think there's, again, for me, when you talk about the sort of the ideal or the vision that we're looking at now, it would be an interesting thing to actually just see what is a possibility in terms of an artistic reflection of that. So the other collection that I have worked with or engaged with is the NTNSA Foundation, which is a contemporary collection that was started in 1996 or thereabouts. And since then, they have managed to collect substantial works from both South Africa and the continent as their business developments sort of spread globally, right? So there's a reflection of a relatively comprehensive contemporary African art collection within the MTN Foundation. And their mandate now has had to change and focus more on ICT or technology-based art-making processes, which brings to question, what do they then do with the works that they have managed to collect over the past years, and how then do they engage with the ICT sector in a way that is binding with the different audiences to which they cater. They have a rigorous program of engaging with UJ and other academic institutions across South Africa, which is, and also they had started, or at least they stopped, unfortunately, they started engaging with contemporary artists through the MTN New Contemporaries. And I think one thing that would need to be considered is why that engagement has stopped, number one, and what it actually means to the contemporary art scene in South Africa when a corporation that had so rigorously and actively supported a certain sector of the arts no longer does so. The third of which is then the UJ Art Collection. The UJ Art Collection is actually made up of three institutions that have been collecting on and off since the 60s and 70s odd, and therefore they've managed to have a rather large collection developed.
Khwezi. Welcome. Hello. I didn't see you coming. Hello. Our panelist, Khwezi Gule. I think we should let you finish, Melissa, and then I'll formally introduce you.
So the issues for me that have sort of come up, especially amidst the fact that this is an election year for South Africa, is what, and this is a very, very important point, what is the role of the contemporary art scene in South Africa? And what is the role of the contemporary art scene in South Africa? And what is the role of the contemporary art scene in South Africa? And what is the role of the contemporary art scene in South Africa? Is what if at all, could the collection or could any of these institutions be reflecting on as the contemporary moment? And how do these ideas then become curated within the public space? And also then, how does one engage with issues of activism, you know, from both a local and a global context? The UJ as an institution has had quite a sort of, the famous whole sort of movement has been reflected in a lot of the Johannesburg based, and also, I mean, across the country, the institutions, the academic institutions. How do those activities that take place in a very public platform find space in museums, in galleries, in different areas of cultural engagement?
Thank you, Melissa. I'm just going to say a few words and give Khwezi a chance to gather his notes and before I introduce him. But already I think it's very interesting to note that in those two presentations we have a sense that perhaps what is different about curating in the 21st century from what it might have been in the 20th century. I don't know if we would have had that conversation actually 20 years ago, thinking about curating in this same way, because curating was much more tightly connected to the museum. The examples that you have brought to our attention today are somewhat detached from the museum. They are part of an expanded field of curating, bringing into the equation the missions and the agendas, the mandates of corporations, of government, of political bodies that were not necessarily the case in the museum world of the 20th century. And perhaps this is where Khwezi will contradict me, as he today on this panel represents the kind of the museum institution, if you will. Khwezi Gule is a curator and writer. He's the chief curator of the Johannesburg Art Gallery. He returned to JAG last year? 2 years ago? December 2017, so a little over a year ago. And he had been curator of contemporary collections at JAG until 2010. In the years in between and before his return to JAG, Khwezi was the chief curator of the Soweto Museums for 8 years, which includes the Hector Peterson Memorial and Museum, as well as the Cape Town Open Air Museum. He has contributed essays to numerous exhibition catalogs, journals, newspapers, and delivered conference papers on the subject of visual arts and heritage. And Khwezi and I curated an exhibition together of Tracy Rhodes, and I haven't seen him for a very long time, so I'm very happy that you are finally here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Renaud. I'm sorry for being late. The plane was delayed by over an hour, and I just had to rush directly here from the airport. And I'm sorry also to have missed the two earlier presentations, but just based on what I heard of the Melissa's presentation, I think that the themes are going to be quite similar. So I wanted to speak quite broadly at first about some of the things about what we understand about curating, or what are the urgent issues that need to be addressed. What are some of the approaches that help us to confront these urgent issues, which I will try to approach a bit later. What are the values and ethics that are pertinent to these questions? What are the specific forms of art, documents, archives, and other kinds of material culture that can help us give expression to such ideas? These questions are also aimed at the kinds of resources and infrastructure that are required to sustain these kinds of inquiry. And the brief response to some of these questions will be dependent on the histories, the various publics, economies, institutional structures, geographies, and of course a range of talents and human capital that, that one has at one's disposal. But of course also the social and cultural attitudes that are prevailing in society at any given moment will also impact on how we answer these questions of what are these values, what are these strategies and approaches that we need to use. And I just want to make a slight diversion in the sense that I want to talk more broadly about South African politics, but very briefly. And that has to do with the fact that I feel we are at a moment where South Africa as a society, but I think the question can be extended to other parts of the world as well, where on the one hand there are certain old structures that have sustained the liberal democratic model, and which has morphed in the past 30 years into the neoliberal model, and how those structures are beginning to falter and fall apart. And we can mention, among other things, the rise of the ultra-right and Brexit and those kinds of things. But also in South African terms, we can look at, for instance, the kind of urgency that the resurgent youth movement has brought about into South African politics, both within the student movement and outside of the student movement. But also associated with that is a kind of political and economic elite that still has quite a tight grip on the levers of power, whether that power is economic or political. So we find ourselves in a time where we are trying to bring about a new society, but we're still held back by the previous structures. Now, what does this mean exactly for curating? So that's where I think, for me, a discussion around what is a museum in South Africa supposed to do. The Johannesburg Art Gallery is also in a very interesting kind of juncture, in the sense that, in the same way that I've described the politics of the country and the social dynamics in the country, we are also at a time where the infrastructure is in urgent need of renewal, but there isn't as yet a plan for thinking ahead about what kind of future it should have. The institution itself is 100 years old, but apart from myself and a few people, there hasn't been a really thought through notion about what it should be for the next 100 years. At the same time, there is a new community that has, or the Johannesburg Art Gallery finds itself in new surroundings. But when I say new, I don't mean like it's happened just overnight, but it happened over the past 20 years. And there hasn't been a really serious and sustained thought around how does this institution now serve this community that it finds itself in. And so I will draw on just a couple of examples. One is something that happened recently at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, which is an installation that was done by the collective Made You Look, which comprises Naren Mokhoto and Molemo Moyuba. And they basically were looking at the whole idea of ornamental gardens in South African, or specifically in the townships of what used to be called the Vaal. And the response was partly that exhibition was partly in response to a text which had been written about how black people don't do ornamental gardening. So the evidence which they used are images from a photographer who was practicing in the 40s and 50s called Robert Gilima, who was a kind of a street photographer, but took a lot of pictures of people in their gardens. So the issue was not, I mean, the objective of the photographer was not to photograph the gardens, but to photograph the people. But people wanted to be seen in those gardens which they themselves had prepared. So this again for me speaks very strongly to something that Pramesh Ladu spoke about quite a long time ago, about how we conceive even of apartheid robs us of our imagination because it's such a narrow focus, and we do not speak about the spaces of leisure even during apartheid. He was speaking specifically in relation to cinema, but the same can be applied to many other contexts, including ornamental gardening. The other part of it was, of this exhibition, was to look at how there is a kind of a fluid direction or movement between what are ornamental gardens, what are herbal gardens as in for healing, but also gardens for food. And so this exhibition was primarily focused on plants and gardening. And what for me was interesting is that when they organized talks around this exhibition, the people who spoke, who were experts, were not artists or curators or administrators, they were gardeners. So that helped to bring an interesting perspective on what it is to curate in an institution that is trying to break away from the bonds of the past. That's the one example. The other example is a conference which I attended in 2015 in Liverpool, which came under the general umbrella of the Glossary of Common Knowledge. And the conference was, there were several institutions around Europe that were part of that conference. At that time I was still at the Hector Peterson Museum, and for me at the time what I was really frustrating is how the kind of curated and very sleek and polished type of exhibition did not speak to the embodied knowledge of the people within the community, which is Soweto. And so for me, what was interesting is two examples that I will cite. One was a museum in Spain, which was, the representative told us that part of what they do is to host an NGO that dispenses hypodermic needles to drug users in order to prevent infections and such things. So they see that as a way, because they also are in a similar situation as the Johannesburg Art Gallery is in now, in that the museum borders a park, and the park is full of drug users. But so for them to allow the museum to do that is in a way a form of being of service to the community and not just to present art. The other example came from Turkey, where the museum had converted itself into a free university, which anybody could attend, and there were different types of classes. So I think that, in terms of our orientation towards what museums are, and in particular art museums, there is quite a wide scope of possibilities. But I think that the success of those museums, and in fact their survival into the future, depends on, firstly, whether or not we're willing to take radical departure from what has been, but also to respond positively to the needs of the communities in which the museums find themselves, which And a part of that, a big part of that, is something that a friend of mine who's here in the audience, I won't embarrass him by mentioning his name, talked about social imagination. So whether or not we as museum professionals are able to conceive of programs and the types of exhibitions that activate that social imagination. Thank you.
Thank you, Khwezi. Thank you all three. I have many questions for all three of you, but I will also open up open up to the floor for questions in a little bit. So please keep your questions at the ready. I loved this. I'm just going to pick on one idea that you've mentioned, Khwezi, this idea that we're trying to bring about a new society, but we're still working with old structures to do it. And I think that's something that's been that's been common in all three of your perspectives. While perhaps more obviously, Khwezi, you're dealing with these old structures of the museum. Melissa and Claudio are able to perhaps use new structures that aren't necessarily easier and kind of, or more flexible, let's say. I don't know if you want to speak to this, either of you, Melissa or Claudio.
The notion of
the notion of how, while we're all trying to, bring about new society, sometimes actually that desire is also imposed upon you by the mandate that directs the context in which you work.
Yeah.
But what are the tools at your disposal that you feel you have that may be different from a museum curator? Like, is there more freedom in being an independent curator or a consulting curator?
No.
Well, as I said before, and I've always been working in the museum field, so for our institution, our centers are non-profit organizations, and I had that standpoint. I must say that specifically to the region where I work in, we have special mandates. The one that I said about the policies of being inclusive and inclusiveness of local artists, it's necessarily a must, so I can't avoid it. Which is, as I said before, a twofold path, because on one side, it allows me to reconsider history with new parameters, so it's opening and broadening up the subject, this is very positive. On the other side, I need to forcibly include it that sometimes it's not necessarily fitting what I'm curating or I have in mind about the exhibition that I'm preparing, so it's twofold, but at the same time, it's a challenge. It's just, I think that the more we are able to expand our field, to question it on an aesthetical and political level, the better. So we don't have any answers in that sense. And art is exactly this, it's just questioning all the time over and over, it's not giving any answer. And this is, I think, the fascinating field that we work in.
I think in my particular context, in as much as there isn't necessarily a structure that I would be working in, or I'm not physically a part of that structure, the challenge comes in trying to read the subtext, or at least the sort of unspoken moral and ethical and value sort of perspective of any kind of institution, right? And trying to at least maneuver your way around it in a way that is impactful enough to ask the kinds of questions that you want to ask in curating the exhibitions. So for example, in my engaging with the UJ art collection, I encountered a beautiful old pianif that isn't very much in the style of the pianif that have become the sort of the poster artworks of the apartheid era. And Pianif as an artist and his work has existed in a very strange way in South African society. I mean, our current deputy exited with a Pianif, thinking that he had every right to sort of have that in his possession, whereas it was actually an asset of the state. So I often find it interesting that there isn't any mindfulness of what or who this particular artist, PNF, represents, in terms of the context of our history, and why it is that his work so comfortably, when it comes to the secondary market, is valued at the value that it is. And what that actually means to the relationship, the very, very unbalanced relationship between black and white artists, old and new. His contemporaries, for example, that were practicing and making art around the same time as him, who were black, don't necessarily fetch those same kind of values that he fetches right now in the auction market. What does that mean? And oftentimes it's difficult to ask those kinds of questions when there is a sort of the possibility of guilt and sort of a self-reflection of an institution in terms of their complicit role in supporting this artist and having this kind of artist in their collection. So there's a play, at least, if you will, that or an acceptance that, in as much as this work is included, it might speak to different audiences in different ways, but my particular inclusion of this work is a very, very specific one.
And deliberate.
Yeah.
I think the three of you spoke about relationships to history in very forceful ways. I was thinking about this idea of, or the sort of contested ideas of inclusiveness that Claudio brought about, because it seems to me that a lot of the work of curators today for the last couple of decades has been to invest in the blind spots of history. You talk about the market, Melissa, and how it left PNF's contemporaries out of the equation, and I think the museum, academia, or history is also culpable of leaving important eras and areas of history out. And we've kind of we've all gone back and mined those histories, and it's certainly been a driving force. And maybe this is a different definition or notion of inclusiveness than the one Claudio suggested earlier. But the deep responsibility of the curator in engaging with history in this way, how do you do it? How do you live with that responsibility?
So, right now at the Johannesburg Art Gallery, there's an exhibition which I curated, which is called All Your Things Are Problematic. And so the exhibition as a whole is drawn from the Johannesburg Art Gallery collection, and it features works that in some way or another have problematic relationships with the colonial gaze and those kinds of things. And so one of the reasons why I even decided to curate this exhibition is that we have this kind of history which, for the most part, in my estimation anyway, we tend to deal with as a kind of, we venerate these artists, uncritically. The Emma Stearns, who's the other very high-selling, artist on the tertiary market, and we don't actually take the time to actually interrogate the work. But actually, the fundamental question for me was, how do we deal with this problematic work that is in our collection? So we could put it away in the storerooms and pretend it doesn't exist, or we could sell it off. But well, we're not allowed to. But it's a possibility, right? Or we can just put it up as and sort of look at it in an uncritical fashion. So for me, the issue was how do we live with the ghosts of the past, but also try at the same time to imagine a different future. And you know, so we had a kind of like a talk around the exhibition, and it became apparent during the conversation that a lot of the work that many of the artists, curators of my generation, have been trying to do is partly to recover or to reclaim works that have been neglected and so forth and so on, but also quite a lot of trying to displace and interrogate work that has of these problematic artists from the colonial and apartheid era. But we haven't, but the complaint amongst the audience members was, but where do we move, where do we go from here, what is the next step? So I think that in as much as we want to think about what the future is, we still have this baggage that we have to somehow grapple with, and how do I relate to images that I feel are personally, but also collectively disempowering. And I was saying to a group of students just yesterday that I'm in a very interesting position because as the head of the museum, I'm supposed to look after these images and protect them, and But on the other hand, I feel very ambivalent about what they mean for me as a person. So it's not as though there are very clear-cut answers about how we deal with this, but I think that these are important conversations to be having at this very particular moment. The second thing that I just wanted to mention, which maybe I should have mentioned earlier, is that we are also doing this kind of work or this kind of thinking in an era where public institutions are extremely and severely defunded, and at the same time private initiatives seem to be thriving. So then the question becomes, how do you not reverse the cycle, but how do you encourage a reinvestment into public institutions so that they can do the kind of social work that is required and is needed and desired?
I see a lot of nodding, so I think we're in agreement. Is there an urgent? If there isn't an urgent response to Khwezi's point from either of you, I just want to give one chance for an audience question because we only have 4 minutes left. Yes, there is one.
So I've got quite a lot of questions, lots. But the biggest question for me is, as a curator working between the artist and the institution, you take on somewhat of a role as a gatekeeper. And so, it's a big yes, it's quite loaded. But the question is, considering the political space of art in South Africa at the moment, in my opinion, there's a feeling that artists are afraid to address real issues. They mention an issue, but they don't call people out in order to be successful as artists. So I see you're not quite sure. What I'm saying is, for example, you mentioned the SASA issue. An artist will mention in an artwork that there's an issue around finances, within a specific sphere, they won't actually call it out as a SASA issue. And that you see as a thread across protest art. And then there's also a heavy, it's almost becoming greedy in terms of commodifying African art. And I feel like the conversation between public and private is connected to that commodification and how things are becoming private, or the arts is being privatized. And that then links to the questions of inclusivity. So my question is, how do you feel, considering that there's a future, a present and a past in terms of curators, you are influencing what is being made in the future from artists, what is being produced, specifically within African and South African art. I personally feel like that there is showcased art is very indicative of African art, it's linked to African art, but because of the commodification, it's being institutionalized, and so the significance of the work as art is becoming problematic, and therefore we're repeating a cycle. But the curator has a role as a gatekeeper in this, and so that's what I'd like some information on, or your thoughts.
Who wants to take the question?
I tried to give another definition, and then it's very inspiring when you said curator as a gatekeeper. I'm also an instructor in a master program at the University of Daniels for curatorial practice. And I have 7 students coming from all over the world, but Europe, being a university based in Italy. And when I was trying with them to understand, they are very fresh, they would be probably promising curators, but are at a very early stage. And I asked them to define themselves with a curatorial statement. And I had a response that was like curator as a storyteller, curator as a connector, as a bridge between past and present. Gatekeeper is a good answer as well. When we decided at the end, based on what we said today, is that curators in the 21st century, most importantly, are provocateurs, in the sense that we are challenging the status quo. And another case in point between public and private is the MoMA in New York. Last week, he made a headline in the New York Times that MoMA is going to reinstall again the collection and bringing up what has been in the storage before, just to reconsider history from another perspective, which means that they're going to be inclusive as well. And if MoMA New York does that, wow, this is a pioneering moment to see what's going to be next for sure.
I think we have to wrap up. I just want to underline maybe something that you said, which I thought was very interesting, which is that the curator also has an influence on artistic practice and our choices. You know, we're not neutral to an ecosystem, we actually have an impact on it. And I'm hoping that by maybe sharing our thoughts and our perspectives with this audience, we are also impacting the way that you'll be judging the exhibitions that we put together or that our colleagues put together, and perhaps demand some of those kind of civic attitudes that we've outlined today. And with this, we'll be around. We'll be around.
No, before you step down and recommend to me as a mic. It's not fine.
I'm sorry, I don't see who is.
I'm not going to stand up. You could hear my voice.
Ah, yes.
I want to acknowledge the beautiful presentation from the 3 panelists. You know, it's beautiful to speak from the institutional experience that you know best. I came here looking to hear what it means to curate in the 21st century. I didn't hear that. So I'm disappointed. All I heard was like this biography of what it means to work, whatever the institution, Gule or Melissa. I'm living with nothing about the 21st century and curating. So I'm disappointed. It's a comment, you don't need to answer on that. I would have loved to hear what it means to curate in the 21st century, the millennium which we are beginning to get old with. That was what is written in this program. I was not looking forward to hear the biographies of Jack, of Constitutional Hero, Papudu, whatever that guy is working at. So I am disappointed. You don't need to